Hangzhou, a city where centuries-old temples stood in solemn grace beside steel skyscrapers, where incense from ancient altars mingled with the scent of roasted chestnuts sold by street vendors. Amid this poetic contrast of tradition and modernity lived a small Muslim family, barely noticed by the wider society yet anchored deeply in faith. Their home was modest, their lives simple, but their presence, especially the presence of their daughter, was quietly extraordinary. Amina, 18 years old, was not like the other girls in her neighborhood. She had memorized the entire Qur'an by the age of 15, and could speak both Arabic and Mandarin fluently. She had a gentle, inquisitive soul and a calm demeanor that concealed an ocean of thought. Her eyes didn't flash with teenage rebellion but shimmered with sincerity, as if the verses of the Qur'an echoed silently behind her gaze. She wasn't loud, but when she spoke, even adults paused to listen, not because she demanded attention, but because truth rarely needed to shout. Her father, Malik, was a Sudanese convert to Islam. Decades earlier, he had come to China as part of a cultural exchange program. It was here that he had discovered the Qur'an, not through lectures or scholars, but by accident in a small library where he sought shelter from a summer storm. He read it quietly, night after night, until the words felt less like a text and more like home. That journey of faith led him to a kind, soft-spoken Chinese librarian named Lian Hua. She was curious about his newfound conviction, and slowly, her own heart opened to Islam, not out of compulsion, but from watching how Malik lived, with kindness, truthfulness, and humility. Their marriage, though culturally uncommon, was a union of souls before society ever understood it. Amina was their only child. She grew up hearing both Quranic recitations and classical Chinese poetry. Her parents taught her that Islam was not just a religion, but a way of walking gently in the world, of feeding the poor without telling anyone, of smiling at neighbors even when they looked away, of holding on to dignity without arrogance. Every week, Amina would accompany her mother to the city park, where they distributed food to the homeless. And after every hand she reached out to, she would whisper a prayer in her heart. "May Allah bless this soul and guide mine." One rainy morning, the family's routine shifted. Malik came home with a flyer in his hand. It was slightly damp from the drizzle outside, but the bold red characters were still clear. Interfaith Harmony Forum, open dialogue on spiritual peace. The city's largest cultural hall was hosting the event. Scholars, monks, philosophers, and thinkers from across China were attending. And among the keynote speakers was a name Malik recognized instantly, Monk Wenjiao. "He's not just any monk," Malik explained. "He's respected across Asia. He's written books on spiritual freedom, emptiness, and the philosophy of detachment. A lot of people listen when he speaks." Lian Hua read the flyer carefully. "Should we go?" "Just to observe," Malik said. "It would be good for Amina. To listen, to understand different views. That's part of our faith too." They didn't expect anything unusual. They certainly didn't expect that date to change everything. The forum was scheduled for the following Thursday. That morning, the sky hung low with clouds, the streets glossed with the sheen of overnight rain. Amina wore a soft white hijab and a pale blue overcoat. She carried a small mushaf in her bag, not for show, but as she always did, as a companion. When they arrived at the cultural hall, the atmosphere was buzzing. People of all backgrounds filled the wide atrium, Buddhist monks in saffron robes, Confucian scholars in long traditional tunics, a few Western academics, and students carrying notebooks. Inside, the hall smelled of aged wood and sandalwood incense. Rows of seats were arranged neatly before a raised stage adorned with calligraphy that read, "Unity without uniformity." Malik, Lian Hua, and Amina found seats near the middle, not too close, not too far. Amina sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes moving thoughtfully between the speakers. When Monk Wenjiao took the stage, a respectful hush fell over the audience. Tall, poised, and confident, He carried the presence of someone used to being listened to. His voice was calm, his gestures deliberate. He spoke about inner peace, about letting go of attachment, about transcending fear. But then his tone shifted. Too often, he said, religions that come from outside our lands bring not peace but division. They bring rules that bind the soul instead of setting it free. They use fear to command obedience rather than love to invite reflection. He didn't name Islam. But he didn't need to. Amina felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not anger. Not offense. Just something unsettled. She gently touched her mother's hand. Ami, she whispered. Can I say something? Lian Hua looked into her daughter's eyes, clear, steady, but stirred. She nodded. If you speak, speak with wisdom. As the moderator opened the floor to audience questions, people lined up near the microphones. Amina rose, walking slowly toward the mic near the center aisle. A few people turned to look. Some raised eyebrows. One or two chuckled under their breath. What could an 18-year-old girl possibly contribute among seasoned scholars? Amina stood at the mic. Her voice was soft, but clear as morning light. My name is Amina. She began in fluent Mandarin. I am a Muslim. I have a question for Monk Wenjiao. The monk, still seated on stage, raised his head and offered a courteous nod. Amina asked, Is peace found by removing all rules, or by following the right ones? A small ripple passed through the audience. Wenjiao replied, Rules can be cages. Real peace comes when the soul is free. Amina tilted her head slightly. If freedom means doing what we want, does that mean it's okay to hurt others if it makes us feel free? The hall froze. Wenjiao paused. No. Of course not. Then that's a rule. Amina replied gently. A rule not to harm others. Maybe not all rules are cages. Maybe some are bridges. Maybe some protect us from hurting ourselves and each other. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Even the cameras turned toward her. Phones were lifted. Something had just shifted. Monk Wenjiao stared at her, not with offense, but with intrigue. This was not what he expected. And may I ask, respected monk? Amina continued, Do you believe in karma? He nodded. Yes. Karma teaches that actions return to the doer. Then karma is also a rule, she said. A hidden one. An invisible law of return. In Islam, we call that accountability before Allah. Perhaps our paths are not so different. The hall remained still. The murmurs had faded. Even the subtle rustling of paper and shuffling of chairs seemed to pause, as if time itself had taken a breath. Amina stood tall, her hands calmly folded, her white hijab pristine against the backdrop of ornate woodwork and incense smoke. But it wasn't her presence alone that held the audience. It was the weight of her words. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't gestured wildly. She had simply asked questions, but they cut like light through morning mist. On stage, Monk Wenjiao's smile was no longer the distant, formal curve of a public speaker. It was something softer, more uncertain. He had debated professors in India and mystics in Europe. He had spoken at conferences in Seoul and Kathmandu. But never before had he been so thoroughly disarmed by sincerity. Especially not from someone so young. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to read more than just her words. You speak well, he said slowly. Are you a scholar? Amina shook her head gently. Just a student of the Qur'an. And a daughter. That line struck something deep in the room. She hadn't claimed titles or degrees. She hadn't spoken with arrogance. She had claimed truth from a place of simplicity. Wenjiao folded his hands. You said something interesting. That some rules are bridges. May I ask, a bridge to where? Amina's voice remained calm, but her eyes gleamed. To our better selves. To Allah. To peace that isn't temporary, but eternal. Someone in the second row whispered, She sounds like she's reciting from scripture. A professor in the third row pulled out a pen and began scribbling notes. Even the cameraman repositioned his frame, zooming in slightly on Amina's serene face. And when you pray, Wen Zhao continued, what do you feel? Amina thought for a moment. I feel seen. Not judged. Not forgotten. Just seen. By the one who made me. There was something about the way she said it. Not rehearsed. Not theoretical. Just truth, spoken like a memory you could still taste. She continued, when I pray, I stand beside people I've never met, black, white, Arab, Chinese, and we bow in the same rhythm, whispering the same words. There is no caste, no wealth, no rank. Just hearts in a line facing God. That's not division. That's unity. This time, the silence wasn't from shock. It was reverence. Two Buddhist nuns seated near the front glanced at each other. One of them mouthed something inaudible, but her eyes were wet. In the back, a theology professor from Beijing University looked down at his notepad, then slowly closed it. He had come to analyze religions. Instead, he found himself listening with his heart. Wen Zhao leaned back. For a moment he didn't respond. He just looked at her, then out at the audience, then back again. You said you are only a student, he said at last. But today I feel like one. Soft applause began in the corner, and spread gently through the hall. No one cheered. No one shouted. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment people clapped with their souls. Amina bowed her head respectfully, then returned to her seat. Her mother, Lian Hua, leaned in and kissed the top of her head without saying a word. She didn't need to. Amina knew what that kiss meant: pride, love, and silent strength. As the forum concluded, speakers gave closing remarks. But the mood had changed. The early air of intellectual pride and philosophical detachment had shifted into something more tender, something more honest. When the event ended, and people began filing out of the hall, Monk Wen Zhao remained on stage, his eyes fixed on the space where Amina had stood. Malik, Amina's father, noticed and approached quietly. She didn't mean to challenge, Malik said gently. Only to ask? Wen Zhao looked up. It wasn't a challenge, he replied. It was a mirror. Malik smiled, not with arrogance, but with the tired joy of a man who had seen his daughter become a woman in front of the world. Most people, Wen Zhao said slowly, speak to be heard. But she speaks to be understood. There is something divine in that. 3 days passed. And yet, the ripples of that moment refused to fade. Clips from the forum began circulating on Chinese social media. On Weibo, a short 90-second video titled, Muslim Girls Answer Leaves Monk Speechless, began trending. On WeChat, users debated whether the girl was real, whether her words were scripted, or if this was part of a larger narrative. On YouTube, translated versions began appearing with subtitles in English, Malay, and Urdu. The title that resonated most read, The Day Veils Spoke Louder Than Words. Some viewers celebrated her courage. Others questioned her authenticity. But none could deny the impact. Meanwhile, inside Amina's home, life became noticeably quieter. One morning, Malik found an envelope taped to the front door. It bore no return address, just a red stamp from the local district office. He opened it carefully. It was a formal notice. Their weekly food distribution program in the park was suspended. The reason cited was lack of appropriate permits. But Malik understood. This was not about permits. It was about pressure. Days later, a bakery owner, who had always welcomed them with a smile, returned their standing order. Just for now, he said, unable to meet Malik's eyes. I hope you understand. And then came the call from Amina's school. Lian Hua was asked to attend a meeting. The principal, a man they had always respected, now spoke with the restraint of someone reciting a script. We value all students, he said. But with recent media attention, perhaps Amina could avoid participation in any future public religious discussions. Just for her safety, of course. Lianhua looked him in the eye. My daughter didn't preach. She answered a question. The principal nodded, his voice low. I know. But the pressure comes from above. We're just trying to avoid escalation. That evening, the family sat in their small living room. The air smelled of jasmine tea. Rain pattered softly on the windows. Amina sat cross-legged, her Qur'an in her lap, a calm look on her face, though her silence was deeper than usual. Abby, she said at last. Did I do something wrong? Malik took her hand. You spoke the truth. And sometimes, truth makes the world uncomfortable, especially when it comes from someone they never expected. Amina nodded. It just hurts. I didn't mean to make anyone angry. Lianhua put her arm around her daughter. The sun makes people squint too, my love. But we still need it to see. Outside, the city of Hangzhou continued in its beautiful chaos. Motorbikes buzzing through narrow streets, temple bells echoing softly in the wind. But inside that small apartment, something profound had begun. A silence that wasn't empty. It was waiting. And far away, in a quiet monastery, monk Wenjiao watched the same 90-second video, again and again. He no longer listened as a teacher. He listened as a seeker. 3 days had passed since the forum, but the echoes of Amina's words had not faded. They had only grown louder. The city of Hangzhou, with all its bustling markets and misty temple rooftops, now felt strangely aware. As if even the wind had paused to listen. Screens in university lounges replayed the forum footage on loop. Subtitled clips circulated across continents. The words of an 18-year-old Muslim girl had transcended borders. But not everyone was celebrating. One morning, Amina woke to the sound of her father's footsteps, heavier than usual, approaching the living room. Malik stood at the front door, holding an envelope. No name. No sender. Just a red stamp from the local district office. He opened it with care. Inside was a formal notice. Effective immediately, your weekly food distribution in Xinghua Park is suspended due to permit non-compliance. He read it twice before quietly placing it on the table. Lianhua, standing nearby with a teacup in hand, didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her sigh said it all. This wasn't about permits. It was about discomfort. About being reminded that sometimes, when truth is spoken from an unexpected voice, people try to silence the voice instead of addressing the truth. That afternoon, Amina and her mother stopped by a local bakery. The shopkeeper, who once smiled warmly and asked about Amina's schoolwork, looked down as they entered. I think, he started hesitantly. It's better if we pause your order for now. For now? Lianhua asked gently. He didn't look up. Just to be safe. No further explanation came. Only silence. A heavy, awkward silence that clung to them as they stepped back out into the drizzle. That night, Amina sat by her window, her mushaf open but unread. She stared through the glass, not looking at anything in particular, just letting the outside blur into abstract shapes of moving lights and shadows. In the corner, her father sat quietly, writing something in his journal. He paused, glanced up at her, and asked, Would you change anything, Amina? If you could go back? She shook her head. No. But I wish it didn't hurt people. Truth often does, he replied softly. Especially when people are comfortable in lies they didn't even realize they were living. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, far from curious eyes and whispers, monk Wenjiao sat alone in his private study. The monastery library, once his sanctuary, now felt foreign, like a room that no longer belonged to him. He stared at his tablet screen, paused on a frame where Amina's face looked upward, eyes calm, expression unshaken. He hit play. Again. And again. Every time she said, Maybe rules aren't cages. Maybe they're bridges. He felt something shift inside. That evening, his disciple, Jian Hui, entered with a tray of tea. He placed it gently beside the monk, but when Zhao didn't respond, his eyes were fixed. Sifu, Jian whispered, you haven't slept much since the forum. I'm not tired, the monk murmured. Jian sat beside him. Are you still upset about what happened? Wen Zhao finally looked away from the screen. No, he said slowly. Not upset. Just undone. Undone? She didn't argue to win. She asked to understand. And she made me realize, I've spent decades seeking emptiness. But I don't know what to do with fullness. Jian didn't reply. He had never seen his teacher like this, gentle, yes, wise, of course. But never vulnerable. I need to speak with her again, Wen Zhao said after a long pause. Not as a monk. Not as a teacher. Just as a man with questions. And so, a quiet request was made through a cultural intermediary. A letter arrived at Malik's apartment 2 days later, sealed, courteous, and brief. You are invited to a private interfaith reflection at the Harmony Center. No media. No audience. Only honest dialogue. Malik hesitated. After what had happened, the risk was not small. But when Amina read the letter, her heart was calm. I want to see him, she said. Her mother looked concerned. Are you sure? Yes, Amina replied. Because when I spoke at the forum, I saw his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was confused. And sometimes confusion is just a soul waiting for a light. The Harmony Center was nothing like the Grand Cultural Hall. It was a circular room, quiet and understated. No stage. No podiums. Just a round table at the center, surrounded by soft mats. The air smelled of jasmine and sandalwood. When Zhao arrived early, not in ceremonial robes, but in a plain gray tunic, he looked older than he had on stage. His face carried exhaustion, not physical, but spiritual. The kind that comes when a person's internal structure begins to shake. As Malik, Lian Hua, and Amina entered, he stood and bowed low. Thank you for coming, he said. The moderator, a soft-spoken professor of comparative religion, welcomed everyone. Today is not a debate. There are no sides. Only seekers. Only questions. They sat. A quiet hum of presence filled the space. After a long moment, Wen Zhao turned directly to Amina. I've thought about your question every day, he said. About rules. About bridges. About being seen by God. I've been teaching for 30 years, and yet I feel like a student again. Amina lowered her gaze respectfully. I'm still a student too, he continued. But I want to ask, how do you know God exists? Truly? Not because you were taught it. But how do you know? Amina didn't rush to answer. She looked at her hands folded in her lap, then at the faint light streaming in through the paper windows. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but steady. Have you ever cried alone in the dark? She asked. And suddenly felt like someone was holding your heart? Wen Ao blinked. He said nothing. That warmth you can't explain, she continued. That comfort that doesn't come from another person. That whisper in your chest saying, I see you. You're not alone. That is God. The monk looked down at his own hands. They trembled slightly. I've felt that, he said. Amina nodded. Then you've already met him. You just didn't know his name. Silence. Even the moderator had tears in his eyes. And the rules you follow? Wen Ao asked. They don't feel heavy to you? They feel like signs on a road, Amina said. If there were no signs, cars would crash. But when the one who made the road gives you the signs, they're not restrictions. They're mercy. A long breath escaped from Wen Zhao's chest, as though a weight he hadn't realized he carried was suddenly gone. "I don't know what to do with this," he whispered. Malik leaned forward, his voice warm. "You don't need to do anything right now. You just need to be honest with where your heart is." "I don't want to go back to who I was," Wen Zhao admitted. "Not because I hated it, but because I now realize how much I was missing." And in that moment, for the first time in his adult life, the monk felt something rare, peace not from detachment, but from connection. Outside, the wind moved gently through the bamboo groves. Inside, a spiritual awakening had begun, not through fireworks or thunder, but through a veil, a voice, and the quiet truth that filled a long empty silence. The wind outside the Harmony Center was gentle, but the storm inside Monk Wenjiao's heart had only just begun. That evening, after the private session ended, he returned to the monastery in silence. Jian Hui, his loyal disciple, greeted him at the door with concern etched across his face. But Wenjiao offered no words, no teachings, only a nod, then disappeared into his private quarters. Inside his study, the shelves were still lined with his own books. Titles in calligraphy adorned their spines: Stillness Beyond Thought, The Quiet Mind, The Mirror Within. For decades, he had written about silence. Now, none of those words could match what Amina had spoken in a single afternoon. He sat cross-legged before the window, watching the candlelight flicker as rain began to fall softly against the glass. In his lap, the Mandarin translation of the Qur'an lay open. A gift from Amina. She had handed it to him quietly after the session. No pressure, no dawah, no demand. "Read it when your heart is ready," she had said. He was. He just didn't know what that meant yet. He flipped the pages randomly, stopping at a verse. "And we are nearer to him than his jugular vein." The words didn't scare him. They comforted him. For a man who had taught the concept of detachment his entire life, the idea that a creator could be intimately near, present, aware, loving, was not oppressive. It was, surprisingly, beautiful. He placed the Quran beside him and picked up his small black notebook, the one he had carried since his early monkhood. For years, it held polished insights, prepared phrases, eloquent metaphors. But now, he scribbled something far less refined. "Perhaps I've mastered silence, but not truth. Perhaps I've let go of ego, but never touched love." He closed the book and extinguished the candle. The room fell into darkness, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. The next morning, Amina returned to her school for the first time in nearly a week. Though she hadn't been officially expelled, she had been asked to take time to reflect. A phrase vague enough to carry the weight of exclusion. As she walked through the courtyard, eyes followed her. Some curious. Some respectful. Others cold. A few students smiled at her, hesitant but genuine. But many whispered, pretending she couldn't hear. "That's the girl from the video. She thinks she's a scholar. Why does she talk like that in public? She's just showing off." Amina walked past them without breaking stride. Her hands gripped her books, but her heart held the Quran. Inside the classroom, she took her usual seat near the window. The teacher, Mr. Zhang, paused when he saw her. "Amina," he said softly. "Welcome back." She smiled. "Thank you, sir." He resumed his lecture on classical Chinese poetry, but even he seemed distracted. At the back of the class, a few students exchanged glances. Their gazes weren't hostile, but they weren't welcoming either. By lunchtime, Amina sat alone under a tree, flipping through her notes. A few girls approached, not with malice, but with nervous curiosity. "Did the monk really cry?" one of them asked. Amina looked up, surprised. "No," she said gently. "But his heart did." Elsewhere in the city, inside a small government office, two officials were reviewing a transcript of the Harmony Center's closed-door session. "She's becoming too visible," one muttered. "The monk too," the other replied. "This could spread. We need to act," quietly. No arrests. No noise. Just containment. And so began a series of quiet obstructions. Permits delayed. Social projects halted. Surveillance increased. Not enough to cause an international stir, but enough to stifle. But there was one thing they could not contain: whispers. Truth whispered spreads faster than slogans shouted. 1 week later, an unexpected request came from Monk Wenjiao. He wanted to visit a school. Not just any school, Amina's school. At first, the principal hesitated. Hosting a religious figure, especially one under public scrutiny, was risky. But after pressure from several prominent academics who had supported the monk's openness to dialogue, the visit was approved, on the condition it would be informal, quiet, and media-free. The day of the visit, Amina didn't know. She was in her classroom, seated at her usual spot, the Qur'an translation closed on her desk, when the door opened and the principal walked in. Behind him stood Monk Wenjiao. The entire class turned. Some gasped quietly. A few whispered. The teacher stepped aside. "I hope you don't mind," the principal said cautiously, "but we have a guest who asked specifically to observe this class." Amina looked up, eyes wide. Wenjiao offered a soft nod. No fanfare. No lecture. Just a quiet presence. He took a seat in the back of the room. The class resumed, awkwardly at first. The teacher tried to focus on the literature discussion, but the weight of the visitor was too great. Eventually, he invited the monk to say a few words. Wenjiao stood slowly. His eyes scanned the students, then rested on Amina. "I came today not to teach," he said, "but to learn. I met someone recently in this school, someone who showed me that even a whisper can hold more light than 1,000 sermons." He turned toward Amina. "You wear the veil," he said gently. "May I ask, what's behind it?" The room froze. All eyes locked on her. Amina didn't flinch. She stood slowly, looked directly at the monk, and spoke with calm certainty. "Behind this veil," she said, "is a heart that remembers God. A tongue that tries not to lie. A mind that knows it's still learning. And a soul that bows only to its creator." Silence. Then someone in the back murmured, "Subhanallah." A girl sitting near Amina whispered, "Can I learn more about that?" And then another voice, "Me too." Wenjiao smiled, not with victory, but with relief. He nodded and sat back down. He didn't need to say anything else. That night, Amina's video went viral again, this time filmed secretly by a student. No official camera. No news outlet. Just a quiet moment in a classroom where truth spoke again, and people listened. In the video, the monk's question was clear. So was Amina's answer. But what truly captured hearts was the pause afterward, a stillness so real it made people cry without knowing why. It wasn't the debate. It wasn't the words. It was the light behind the veil. The video from the classroom, though not meant for public release, found its way onto the internet by morning. The moment Monk Wenjiao asked Amina what lay behind her veil, and her calm, profound answer, was now on millions of screens across China, and beyond. It spread without captions, but it didn't need them. People felt it. The pause in the room. The breathlessness in the monk's eyes. The stillness after her words. By noon, it was trending under the title, "The Question That Changed a Monk." But for Monk Wenjiao, the real change was happening far away from comment sections and camera flashes. He had left the school that day without speaking to the press, without offering a closing remark. His heart was full, but his thoughts were heavy. Not because he doubted Amina, but because he was beginning to question everything he had once believed with certainty. Back in his monastery, his presence became quieter than usual. His lectures stopped. His students were told he was on sabbatical. But the truth was more complicated. He wasn't resting. He was wrestling. One evening, After his fellow monks had retired, he made his way to a small secluded hut nestled in the Yandang Mountains, a place where he had once come to find silence. This time, he came not for silence, but for answers. The wooden floor creaked under his weight as he stepped inside. He placed a small oil lamp on the table and lit it. Then he took out 2 books, one, a collection of his own writings on emptiness and detachment. The other, the Qur'an in Mandarin translation, still bookmarked where Amina had marked a verse. Indeed, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. He read it again. And again. The words did not demand belief. They simply invited it. Like water to a thirsty soul. Wen Zhao closed his eyes. For so many years, he had trained himself to observe his thoughts like clouds in the sky, watching them drift without attachment. But now, he felt something deeper. Not a thought. A yearning. A pull. If God was near, why had he spent his life pushing him away? He remembered Amina's words. When I pray, I feel seen, not judged, not forgotten. Just seen. And for the first time in his long spiritual life, he allowed himself to speak not as a monk, but as a man. Alone in that hut, with only the Qur'an and a candlelight, he whispered, "If you are there, I am here." Tears fell. Not of sorrow, but of surrender. The next morning, Malik received an unexpected call. It was from Wen Zhao's assistant. "He requests a private meeting," the voice said. "No media. Just your family." Malik agreed without hesitation. They met in a simple tea house at the edge of the city. No cameras. No microphones. Just the fragrance of jasmine tea and the soft clinking of porcelain cups. Wen Zhao looked thinner, but lighter, as if something heavy had finally been put down. "I don't know the rituals," he said after a long silence. "I don't know the details. But I know one thing." He turned to Amina. "You said once that the heart already knows. I think mine does. I don't want to wait anymore." Amina's eyes softened. "Then don't." And there, in that quiet tea house with no fanfare, no politics, and no scholars, the former monk closed his eyes and repeated after Malik. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." The room stilled. Wen Zhao, now Abdul Hakim, opened his eyes. He was no longer a monk. But he had never felt more whole. News travels fast, even when you try to hide it. By the end of that week, multiple Buddhist councils issued statements condemning what they called a spiritual betrayal. His teachings were pulled from libraries. Former students publicly distanced themselves. And one night someone defaced the wall outside his former monastery with red paint. Traitor to tradition. But Abdul Hakim did not flinch. He had already walked away from everything, reputation, position, honor. Yet for the first time, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. He moved to a quieter district and began studying Islam more deeply with Malik. At night, he would pray slowly, awkwardly, but sincerely. Every motion foreign, every word new, yet every breath filled with meaning. Amina, too, faced backlash. Though she had been allowed back into school, the administration remained cold. Some classmates avoided her. Others mocked her behind her back. But she never answered them with anger. Only with silence, prayer, and that same quiet confidence that had once disarmed the monk. One afternoon, a small package arrived at their door. No sender. Just a flash drive inside. Malik plugged it into his laptop. It contained a single video clip, filmed secretly. It showed a group of 3 high school girls sitting together. One of them whispered, "You know, ever since I heard that girl talk, I haven't stopped thinking about God." Another nodded. "I started reading the Qur'an in secret." And then the third, "She didn't even try to convert us. She just lived it." Amina watched the video, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Alhamdulillah." Then came the invitation. an international interfaith symposium in Malaysia. Organizers had seen the classroom video and the tea house interview. They requested Amina and Abdul Hakim to attend as honored guests, not to represent a religion, but to represent transformation. They accepted. At the event, Abdul Hakim was the last speaker on the final night. He stood before thousands of attendees, scholars, religious leaders, journalists, and students. "I spent decades trying to empty myself," he began. "But what is emptiness, if not a hunger for something real?" He paused, then looked directly at Amina, seated in the front row. And then a girl spoke. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She just told the truth, without needing to prove it. He turned to the audience. "I found Islam not in a book, not in a lecture, not in a ceremony, but in the sincerity of someone who carried her faith like a flame, quiet, steady, and unafraid of the dark." The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. When it was Amina's turn, she simply said, "You don't need to be old to carry wisdom. You just need to be honest with your heart." By the end of that night, 3 Buddhist monks from Thailand, who had attended out of mere curiosity, approached Abdul Hakim. One of them said, "I didn't come here to change my faith. But I came looking for peace. And I think I found where it lives." Back in Hangzhou, the change was quiet, but real. Some who once avoided Malik's family now greeted them with cautious warmth. A few teachers who had remained distant approached Amina with small, respectful nods. And one morning, a note appeared on their doorstep. "Thank you for reminding us what faith is supposed to look like." The ink was smudged. Maybe from the rain. Maybe from tears. If Abdul Hakim had hoped his quiet conversion would slip past the gaze of the powerful, he had miscalculated. Back in China, headlines began to shift tone. First came curiosity. Famous monk seen in Muslim prayer. Then came hostility. Cultural betrayal or personal choice. Within days, the state-run news hinted at external ideological influences attempting to manipulate spiritual harmony. But no one needed to spell it out. The narrative was clear. Abdul Hakim's decision was not just a personal one, it was a threat. He was removed from every academic position he had ever held. His lectures were pulled from university websites. Bookstores quietly stopped carrying his publications. The quiet monastery where he had spent most of his life closed its gates to him. Even more painful was the silence of those he had once called brothers. No letters. No phone calls. No knocks on his door. It wasn't rejection alone. It was erasure. And yet Abdul Hakim smiled more in those days than he had in years. One evening, as he sat with Malik after Maghrib prayer, sipping tea beneath the soft glow of lantern light, he said, "I used to speak in rooms filled with applause, yet I felt hollow. Now I whisper to God alone, and my heart is full." Malik nodded. "You lost the world, but you found yourself." Abdul Hakim looked toward the heavens. "I lost nothing worth keeping." But the fire was spreading. The story of Amina and Abdul Hakim reached places no one expected: Africa, Indonesia, Turkey, even South America. Translations of her words appeared on blogs, podcasts, and independent media channels. Her quiet composure, her logic, her unwavering belief wrapped in humility, became a beacon. But in her own city, the air was tightening. One night, a rock shattered the living room window of Amina's home. The sound rang like a shot. Her mother screamed. Malik rushed to the front gate. Spray painted in red on the wall. "Go back to your country." They called the police. The officers arrived hours later, sluggish and indifferent. One of them shrugged and said, "Probably kids." Another whispered, "You're bringing too much attention." No arrests were made. No real investigation began. That night, Malik nailed wooden planks over the broken window with his bare hands. Inside, Amina sat silently by the candlelight, her Qur'an closed beside her. Lianhua brought her a glass of water and touched her shoulder. You can cry, you know. Amina looked up. Her eyes were dry, but her voice trembled. I'm not afraid, Ami. I'm just tired. Why does truth make people so angry? Her mother knelt beside her. Because truth burns away the lies they've wrapped themselves in. And not everyone is ready to feel the heat. The next day, Amina did something no one expected. She made a video. Just 2 minutes long. No editing. No music. No branding. She stood in front of the shattered glass, still patched with wood, and looked straight into the camera. Her voice was calm. My name is Amina. I was born here. I go to school here. I play on the same streets, breathe the same air. But now I'm being told to leave, just because I believe in God. She paused. I didn't yell. I didn't insult. I just spoke the truth. And if that makes me a threat, then maybe you're afraid not of me, but of the light I carry. Her voice lowered. If faith makes me an outcast, then I accept it. Because I'm not alone. God is with me. And that's enough. She ended with a soft, Assalamu alaikum, and turned off the camera. They uploaded it anonymously. But it didn't matter. The world already knew who she was. The video exploded. Within 24 hours, it had been translated into 15 languages. Muslim communities across the globe reposted it under a unified hashtag Voice Behind the Veil. A prominent Christian pastor in Canada tweeted, Faith like this humbles even those outside her tradition. A Buddhist monk in Nepal wrote, Her voice reminded me of why I first sought spirituality, not for pride, but for peace. Even secular journalists who disagreed with her beliefs admitted, We need more voices that speak softly but carry fire. But where there's light, darkness always follows. That same week, an anonymous caller contacted Abdul Hakim. The voice was sharp, male, and mechanical. You have 2 choices, it said. Return to your old beliefs and correct your mistake publicly. Or be erased. He remained silent. The voice continued. Your books will disappear. Your name will be deleted from academic records. No monk, no scholar, no legacy. Abdul Hakim smiled bitterly. You think I care about my name? I just met the one who knows me by my soul. The line went dead. But the threat was real. The next day, the last bookstore in Hangzhou carrying Abdul Hakim's old titles pulled them from shelves. In response, he did something radical. He lit a fire in the alley behind his small apartment. One by one, he dropped copies of his own books into the flames, not out of anger, but as an offering. Like a tree shedding its leaves for something new to bloom. Watching the pages curl, he whispered, I have written about emptiness long enough. Let me now live in fullness. At the same time, Malik received a message from Farid, the Muslim journalist from Shanghai who had interviewed Amina weeks ago. This is bigger than we thought, he said. International news outlets want to speak with her. But if you're not ready, I'll say no. Malik turned to Amina. She was sitting in the same spot by the window, head resting on her knees, watching the sunset bleed into the rooftops. Do you want to speak again? He asked. She shook her head. I already did. Farid understood. But he asked for one final quote to include in his next article. Amina thought for a long moment. Then she said, Sometimes truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be said once, clearly, sincerely, and then it will echo where it's meant to be heard. Far away, in a mountain village where the fog rolled in thick and slow, a small group of villagers had built a modest structure beside a stream. It was a masjid. Nothing grand. No minaret. Just 4 walls, a clean floor, and the Qur'an on a shelf. Abdul Hakim stood outside the door, barefoot in the damp earth, hands raised in prayer. His eyes were closed. His lips trembled with gratitude. He didn't miss the monastery. He didn't miss the lectures. He didn't even miss his old name. Because now, when he prayed, he wasn't teaching others how to detach. He was finally attached. To truth. To God. To peace. It had been several weeks since the classroom video. In Hangzhou, the rains had begun to lift, giving way to spring blossoms that pushed their way through damp soil and cracked pavement. But for Amina's family, life remained under quiet scrutiny. The broken window had been repaired. The walls had been repainted. But some things couldn't be patched so easily. Malik still noticed the occasional marked car parked down the street, the same unfamiliar faces lingering near the gate. At school, the tone had shifted from direct confrontation to passive coldness. Amina was no longer harassed. She was simply avoided. But she didn't mind. Because by now, she had learned that truth had a cost, and that the more valuable it was, the higher the price. That morning, she sat by the small rooftop garden her father had built years ago. A clay pot held a single tulip blooming in the sun, and Amina sat beside it with her mushaf resting in her lap. She traced the pages with her fingers slowly, not reciting aloud, but letting the words speak inside her. Her mother brought her tea and sat down beside her. "You've changed," Bienhua said softly. Amina looked over. "For better or worse?" Her mother smiled. "For deeper." They sat in silence for a while, until Malik came up the stairs holding a letter. "It's from abroad," he said. "You've been invited again." Amina took it with curiosity. The seal read, Al-Qamar Institute for Interfaith Engagement, Istanbul, Turkey. Inside was a handwritten letter, not from an administrator or media outlet, but from a student. It read, "I used to hate the veil. I thought it was weakness. But then I saw your video. I heard your voice. And now, I think maybe strength looks different than I was taught. Thank you for being brave without shouting. Thank you for not needing to win, but still making others think. I don't know if I'll ever wear the veil. But I now understand why someone would." Amina folded the letter carefully and tucked it between the pages of her mushaf. She didn't need stage lights or microphones. That letter was enough. Meanwhile, in the quiet village nestled in the Yandang Mountains, Abdul Hakim was no longer the monk with answers. He was the seeker with tools. Each morning, he swept the courtyard of the small masjid. He brewed tea for guests. He washed the prayer mats with his own hands. And every Friday, he gave short talks, not lectures, but reflections. He spoke not about superiority, not about comparison, but about what it means to be still, and then be found. People came in small numbers. A farmer. A teacher. A traveler. A single mother with 2 sons. They sat quietly, listened, and left with softened hearts. One evening, a group of young men from the city arrived. 3 of them were Buddhist students. One of them had once studied under Abdul Hakim before his conversion. "We didn't come for debate," the former student said. "We just came to sit." And they did. For hours. No talk. No preaching. Just presence. Before they left, one of them whispered, "I've never felt this quiet before." Back in Hangzhou, Farid published his final piece. It wasn't an article this time. It was a reflection. Titled, "When Truth Whispers, the World Leans In." It chronicled the journey of a girl who didn't set out to preach, didn't ask for attention, didn't fight to be heard. She simply told the truth. And the truth did the rest. In the final paragraph, he wrote, "She didn't become a symbol by design. She became one by sincerity. And perhaps in a world screaming for attention, it was her quiet conviction that made the world finally stop and listen." The article went viral. Again. But Amina stayed home. She spent her days with her family. She still went to the park, though no food distributions were allowed. Instead, she sat on a bench and read Qur'an aloud, softly, just loud enough for the wind to carry it. Sometimes children sat near her, pretending not to listen. Sometimes old men glanced from a distance. Sometimes, no one stopped at all. But she never missed a day. Because it wasn't about who heard. It was about who needed to. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the school. It was addressed to Amina, but not from a media outlet, a university, or an admirer. It was from her school principal. She opened it slowly. Dear Amina, I owe you an apology. In trying to protect this institution, I failed to protect what mattered most, truth spoken with dignity. I watched your video again last night. Not as a principal, but as a father. I saw not a rebel, but a reflection of the kind of child I hope to raise. You reminded me that silence is safe, but not always right. You are welcome here. Always. John Wei. She closed the letter gently. And smiled. Years passed. The world moved on, as it always does. New crises, new controversies, new stories filled the headlines. But in certain corners of the world, people still whispered about the girl in the white veil. Her classroom words were quoted in sermons. Her video was used in ethics classes in universities. Her name was etched silently in the minds of those whose hearts had shifted without needing to admit it aloud. Amina never pursued a platform. She never wrote a book. She never accepted speaking tours. But her one act of courage lived longer than most shouting matches. And far away, in the Yandang Mountains, Abdul Hakim continued to water the earth where his old monastery once stood. He never rebuilt it. Instead, he planted trees. Olive trees. One day, as he stood among them, a boy from the village came running. Teacher! He shouted. There's someone here to see you. She says she brought something from Hangzhou. Abdul Hakim turned slowly. Amina stood by the edge of the orchard, now a few years older, holding a small gift in her hands, a handwritten mushaf, copied in her own careful script. For your masjid, she said, placing it in his hands. He opened it slowly, and on the first page, in soft calligraphy, was written, To those who seek light, behind veils, behind doubts, behind silence. He looked up at her, eyes glistening. You still carry the flame, he said. She smiled. It was never mine. I'm just the lantern. They prayed together that afternoon under the trees, their voices low, their hearts steady. No cameras. No speeches. Just faith. Just light. And when the sun began to set behind the mountains, it cast golden rays across the orchard, making it look, for a moment, as if the trees themselves were whispering thanks.